The fifth period is the period of 1880 until World War I. So World War I was 1914 to 1918. And before we talk about the rest of the period, I just want to say that this period was an awful period for Indigenous people in Canada. Indigenous people were losing their land. They were being forced onto reserves. Their children were being taken away from them and sent to residential schools, which we've already talked about, where many of the children were abused and often even killed. Native people had no real legal rights under the Indian Act. They couldn't own land, they couldn't vote. They had to get a pass to leave their reserve from a person called an Indian agent. The Indian agents were often awful, corrupt men who took bribes, stole things, raped women, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it's just a horrible period for Native people. This is a residential school in Saskatchewan. I just wanted to show you one of them. So there you have out front one of the Catholic priests who ran this. And these little tiny windows up on the roof, they are the dormitories there where the kids slept. So just imagine you're like a little Native kid. You've spent the early years of your life running free around the plains and being parented by basically your entire community. And then you are taken away. Your hair is shaved. You are given a new name that you can barely pronounce because it's not in your language. You're told you're not allowed to speak your language. You're not allowed to talk to your siblings who are also at the same school. You are beaten. You are poorly fed, and you have to sleep in these tiny little rooms with a whole bunch of other kids. And that's just the beginning of your experience. So this is the period during which the composition of immigrants to Canada changes. It starts to be fewer of the British and Western European people who the British Canadian government preferred, and more folks from Eastern Europe and from Asia. So the reason for this is that the Trans-Canada Railroad was finished. It was finished in 1885. And this opened up the West. So the railroad running through the prairies meant that more settlement could happen on the prairies. It was getting harder to attract immigrants from the United Kingdom and the United States to settle on the prairies. So most of the immigrants from the United Kingdom were city folk, and they were not particularly interested in the difficult frontier that was the prairies. And the United States was, again, quite a bit more developed than Canada. They had the advantage of hundreds of years of free slave labor, which radically helped them become more of an economic power and grow more cities, etc. So most Americans did not want to leave that to come settle on Canada's sort of vast and empty prairies. Canada had decided that they were going to be the breadbasket of North America, so that we were going to grow wheat on the prairies. And so they needed rural settlers. And again, the British were not that impressed. So even people were coming to Canada and leaving to go to the United States. So by 1900, more than 1 million former Canadians had gone to the United States. This was a period that saw lots of industrial growth. It was basically railroad based, and this led to a need for industrial workers. And businesses actively recruited immigrants elsewhere and worked to bring them here to Canada. So elsewhere included India, China, a little bit Japan, Europe, Eastern Europe, etc. So again, here's another example of the advertising that I talked to you about. So this is from about the 1920s. It's an advertisement that was supposed to attract people from the United States. And so first of all, it's supposed to attract white farmers. You can tell because of the white lady and all the farms in the background. She's holding back wheat sheaves here. And if you look, I've got little scribbles here because look, there's hydro lines, there's cars, there's big fancy farmhouses and big fancy painted barns. These are affluent farms that are being shown here. And this is not, again, what the prairies looked like for the most part. This is maybe what some places in Ontario looked like by the 1920s, but not so much the prairies. So again, this is meant to attract farmers to come up and settle. As we approach 1900, there's been a growth in unions among European workers. So there's a long tradition of something called guilds in Europe. So all the shoemakers, say in Bavaria, all belong to the Brotherhood of Shoemakers. And if something happened to a shoemaker, because back then there's no unemployment insurance, no welfare, no pensions. So if something happened to a shoemaker, he was injured or killed, the other shoemakers would pool their money and give it to his family so that they could get by. Guilds represented their trade to the nobility, etc. And guilds sort of transformed into unions. So Europeans often had some kind of experience with guilds or unions, and so as workers in Canada, they formed unions and pushed back against bosses. They were unwilling to accept extremely poor work conditions. They wanted better wages. And because they protested and pushed back, businesses started bringing in completely unassimilated low-wage workers from East and South Asia, so China and areas around China, and India and areas around India. So even today, bosses often prefer less assimilated workers. Why is that? Why are less assimilated workers desirable to bosses? So basically because they can be more easily exploited, right? They are less likely to have connections. They're less likely to know their rights. They don't have a lot of choices and options. So between 1881 and 1884, almost 16,000 Chinese were brought in to work the BC line of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. By 1901, there were almost 24,000 Asian people in Canada. Of that, about 1,700 of them were East Indians, and about 4,700 were Japanese. By 1907, 25% of the British Columbia workforce was of Asian origin. So if anyone ever in your presence suggests that Asian people do not belong in Canada, feel free to kick them in the shins and tell them that actually Asian people built this country, and especially the province of BC. There are all sorts of other ethnic groups entering Canada at the same time. Right? So in the 1880s, you have Jews fleeing pogroms. In the 1880s, you also have Hungarians settling in Saskatchewan. In the 1880s, the Canadian Pacific Railroad brought over almost 50,000 Italians between 1880 and 1911. In the 1890s, Ukrainians began to settle in Manitoba. In the early 1900s, between 1905 and 1908, for the most part, there was an influx of about 4,000 Sikhs to British Columbia. By 1907, there were 8,000 Japanese, mostly in British Columbia. They'd been settling in Canada since 1877. So by 1921, non-British people made up 17% of the population of Canada. So many of the Jews who came to Canada from Russia came because they were fleeing pogrom. A pogrom is originally a Russian word meaning riot, but it's come to be applied to violent mob attacks of Gentiles on Jews in Eastern Europe, mostly in the late 19th and early 20th century, although I have heard that there have been some similar kinds of occurrences in some of the more fascist countries of Eastern Europe lately. Pogroms were very few before the assassination of Russia's Tsar Alexander II in 1881. And after that, encouraged by the Russian government's anti-Semitism, there were many throughout Russia. Often, soldiers and police stood and watched the violence and did not help the Jewish folks. These encouraged the emigration of Russian Jews. In 1903, there was an extremely violent three-day pogrom at Chisinau. 45 Jews lost their life, and Jewish people, many of them picked up and left Russia. It hasn't been proven that the Tsarist government organized the pogroms, but the policy certainly encouraged them. When there was an attempt to overthrow the Tsar in 1905, they increased in number and violence. The Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution in 1917, basically stopped pogroms. I won't say that the USSR was Jewish friendly. It was definitely still anti-Semitic, but they didn't sort of sick the peasantry on the Jewish ghettos in the Russian cities in the same way. Pogroms were revived in Germany and Poland when the Third Reich, the Nazis, attained power under Adolf Hitler. So here you have a picture of a Jewish family arriving in Quebec City in 1911. And you might note that there's someone missing from this image, right? So you've got mom and kids and no dad. So two theories. One theory is that dad is the person taking the picture. The other theory is that they have come to Canada because they have lost their father in a pogrom. And I've got this young fellow sort of circled here because you'll notice that while his sisters managed to hold still and look at the camera for as long as was necessary back then to develop a photograph, he just can't, right? So his head is a blur because he's looking all around at all of the interesting things. Period 6 is the period between the world wars. It was a time of restriction and reduction. Most of the immigrants and most of the population in Canada were in urban areas and working. World War I concluded in 1919, and because capitalism does very well in war, capitalism really benefits from disaster, there was a recession. So there were wage cuts, there was mass unemployment. During the war, unions had grown quite a bit stronger. Labor historians think that this is because during the war there was this huge propaganda campaign, right? You know, do this for your country, do this for democracy, do this to preserve democracy. But workers were not working in democratic environments, right? Most of our jobs are not democratic. They're extremely hierarchical. We're supposed to do as we're told, and we don't get votes. And so people were sort of like noticing the contradiction between the propaganda, democracy, and their actual lives, which really lacked democracy. And so they joined unions because unions are democratic organizations and allow workers to push back against policies that bosses inflict on them that hurt them. At the end of the war, there was a push on the part of the unions to try and win something called collective bargaining rights. So now, if you and your work colleagues organize a union and you have to get 50% plus one to get a union certified in Ontario, so it has to be a majority, and unions are democratic, as I said, but it doesn't, under law now, if you go through that process, you democratically vote in a union, then under Canadian law, your boss has to negotiate with that union. The union becomes the legal representative for all the workers in the workplace, and the boss has to deal with that union legally. But that law only dates from 1946. So in 1918, 1919, these folks organized unions and they wanted to negotiate contracts with their bosses, but the bosses didn't have to sit down at the table and negotiate, and many didn't. Many just sort of ignored the fact there was a union. They fired the organizers or fired everyone who had belonged to the union and rattled on. So the only thing that unions could do to try and get the bosses to sit down with the union, and that's the term union recognition, to actually recognize the union, was to go out on strike. Right, and to stop the boss from making any money in that factory until they agreed to sit down and negotiate with the union. So there were lots and lots of strikes for this, for union recognition. And in Winnipeg, there was one group of metal building trades workers whose boss just would not sit down with the union. And so another group of unions said, hey, you know, our boss golfs with your boss. It wasn't golf, but, you know, they hung out together. And so maybe if we go on strike, you know, our boss will help pressure your boss into recognizing your union. And so they went out on a solidarity strike. And then more and more people followed. And by May in 1919, just about everybody who was a worker in Winnipeg was out on strike. The police were out on strike. The servers, food servers were out on strike. The milkmen were on strike. The factory workers were on strike. Basically everybody was on strike. The strike committee was elected by the strikers. There were representatives from a number of unions, and they ran the town. They kept the movie theaters open so people would have something to do in their time not working. There were big meetings and lectures and sort of teach-ins, we call them teach-ins today, in the parks in Winnipeg. They made sure that milk continued to be delivered, that bread continued to be baked, so that people weren't starving, etc. And really, it was 6 weeks of a very peaceful strike. But the business and government reacted very badly. They were worried that something like the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, would happen in Canada. And in Russia, all the rich people lost their riches, right? They had them taken away by the state and distributed among other people. And so the rich people were really afraid of that. So the business and governments said that the strikers were trying to overturn the government, which they weren't really. They were just trying to get union rights. Eastern European immigrants were scapegoated. We'll talk about scapegoating a little later on in the course, but it's when the Eastern European immigrants were blamed for the whole thing, right? Which was totally inaccurate, but allowed the media and the other people who were scapegoating the Eastern European immigrants to mobilize stereotypes and prejudice against Eastern Europeans in service of their goals. So the general strike was ended when the Canadian government sent in the military, and the military attacked a peaceful crowd. One man was shot, 100 were injured. The military and these folks who were special police, they were basically private security, who the business owners had armed, dove into the crowd and hurt people. The leaders of the general strike were arrested. They were charged with treason. They were threatened with deportation. There were these big movements to try and get immigrants fired so that the soldiers could have the rare returning jobs. Now, I just want to point out that this is a ridiculous statement in Canada, because the vast majority of the soldiers were immigrants, right? So. Here you have the Winnipeg General Strike Committee, and the gentleman in the center of the circle here is J.S. Woodsworth. He went on to be an MP in Canada's Parliament, and he was the one who introduced old age security, which is a really important part of our social safety net, and you will appreciate it when you get older, if it's still there. So the Immigration Act that was passed after the Winnipeg General Strike was, well, nasty. It reduced the number of non-British or non-American immigrants, so that's racism, right? That's an assumption that Eastern Europeans were a sort of bad subversive influence. It stopped the immigration of those groups that I talked about earlier. So the Mennonites, the Doukhobors, the Hutterites, mostly these folks were Eastern European. Many of them spoke German. And so they kind of got lumped in and stereotyped with the scapegoated Eastern Europeans. This law developed ways to deport people, and it included a list of people who were not allowed into the country. So if you could not read or write in English or French, if you had a chronic illness, or if you were left-wing. What does it mean to be left-wing? It doesn't mean that you're left-handed. It means that you believe in sort of more socialist or social democratic ideas, right? You believe in unions, you believe in the equal distribution of wealth, you believe in social programs. Nowadays, it would mean that you support feminism, that you support queer rights, that you are anti-racist, etc. Okay, so after 1919, if it was obvious that you supported unions, that you belonged to anything sort of socialist or communist, etc., you would not be allowed into Canada. That law was followed by the Chinese Immigration Act in 1923. Sometimes that law is called the Chinese Exclusion Act. We'll be talking more about it in a couple of weeks. And it basically stopped immigration from China. In 1923 as well, Canada changed the definition of British subject. So one of the big lies of the British Empire is that once you are colonized by Britain, you become a British subject and all British subjects are equal. And of course, all British subjects are not equal. Under the British Empire, if you were a British subject, you were allowed to go live in any other British territory. All right, so this meant that the British subjects of India, of the Caribbean countries, etc., were free to come live in Canada until 1923. So the government changed the definition of British subject. So now it didn't mean everybody in the British Empire. Now it only meant citizens from Commonwealth countries with predominantly white populations, which pretty much meant Australia and New Zealand, and, you know, of course, England and Ireland and Scotland. So who were they trying to keep out? Mostly Caribbeans, but also Indian immigrants. And in 1931, the beginning of the Depression, the government passed an order in council. You'll remember from your concepts, an order in council is a quickie way of passing a law without due process, really, that only British subjects and American citizens were allowed to come into the country. The immigration in this period was urban and industrial. So most of the immigrants ended up in Montreal or Toronto or Winnipeg, Vancouver, or Sudbury, Timmins, Port Arthur, and the Sioux, which were big industrial centers at the time. So the end of World War II, 1945, until 1967 is our second last period. In 1947, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King said, and you've got to imagine this in a kind of posh British accent, Canadians do not wish to make a fundamental change in the character of their population. So that's a euphemism. That's a way of saying that Canada should stay white. So after the war, 46% of the folks that were admitted into the country were British. Canada accepted 166,000 displaced persons, or DPs. These folks were the refugees of World War II. Much of Europe was a terrible mess, all right? Japan was also a terrible mess. And a good chunk of Europe had also been claimed by the USSR. So many of these folks came from areas in now or near the USSR. They were Polish, they were Ukrainian, some of them were Russian, Hungarian, Jewish, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Slovenes, Serbs, and Croats. They faced intense discrimination on their arrival. I didn't really understand this at all, and I mentioned it to my parents one night at the dinner table when I was visiting, and Mom, who grew up near Burlington, she told me that when they were young and they would go down to the beach, there were often signs on the beaches of Lake Ontario that said, "No Slavs." So that's Eastern Europeans. Reflecting the same kind of intolerance, between 1952 and 1956, a new Immigration Act was passed, and this was, again, a nasty immigration law. It allowed the denial of admission to Canada based on your ethnicity, your citizenship, you having peculiar customs like wearing a sarong, a turban, or eating with chopsticks. The probable inability to assimilate, and it was very subjective and ethnocentric. It enabled very racist assessments of immigration applications. 1959 to 60 was World Refugee Year, and Canada acknowledged this by letting in a whopping 3,500 additional people. The one good thing about it was that people who were disabled or chronically ill who were never admitted in other times were among those. Now in 1962, things start to change. Towards the end of the term, we'll be talking about Canada's civil rights pioneers. And you'll notice that a lot of what they were doing was in the 50s. It's sort of the way social change works, right? Sometimes you can't immediately see the harvest of the work that activists are doing. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. So 1962, things begin to change. So a new set of immigration regulations is brought in. I want to be clear, regulations is very different from an act. So it wasn't a new law, it was the same Immigration Act, but they changed the rules within it a bit. And the way they changed them was to get rid of the majority of the ethnicity-based restrictions on immigration. These new rules were based on the economic needs of Canada. So instead of assessing you by your race or by the country you came from, right, now people were assessed based on their level of education, their training, and their skill, right? Unfortunately, they still favored immigrants from the United Kingdom because they were more likely to count as highly qualified. So if you had a degree from Cambridge, it held a lot more weight than a degree from the University of Lahore. In Canada, there is this tradition, I think it's a good tradition, of studying things in order to make policy. So there's these things called royal commissions. We'll be talking about a few of them when we talk about Asian immigrant workers. There are these papers that get published periodically. So the white paper of on immigration was released in 1966, and it was the result of some sort of experts and some research. And it had recommendations for new immigration regulations to come into place in 1967. One of the regulations suggested was a restriction on sponsored immigration. Now, sponsored immigration is the form of immigration that allows people to bring their family members to Canada. This idea that sponsored immigration would be limited or stopped really upset people in immigrant communities, right? And this really amazing thing happened, right? Is the folks in the Caribbean community, when they read in the paper that there might be limits on sponsorship, they called their MP and they said, hey, if you make it so I can't bring my brother over from Jamaica like I was planning to next year, I'm never going to vote for you again, right? The Italian folks in Little Italy down College Street, they ended up talking about it in the coffee houses. The older Italian ladies called their MPs and they said, hey, if you make it so I can't bring my son over or my daughter over next year, like we've been saving up to do, then we're never ever going to vote for you again, right? Mrs. Wing read about it in her little shop on Spadina, and she's pregnant and she'd been planning on bringing over her mother-in-law to help her with the kid. So she calls her MP and she says, look, if you make it so I can't bring over my mother-in-law to help me when I give birth, I'm never ever going to vote for you again. So politicians finally got the message that if they are going to keep immigrants' votes, they have to make policy that immigrants want, right? So it was the first time that immigrant communities sort of flexed their muscles as a vocal political force in Canada. Now we're in the last period. So in 1968, Canada changed their immigration regulations. Admission to Canada was now based on something called, this is for independent immigrants, so not sponsored immigrants, independent immigrants, is now based on something called the merit point system, right? The merit point system keeps changing, so this is not the way it works today. It's very different today. You can easily look up how you get points today. I think nowadays you need 67, and they're different. But originally you needed 50 points, and you got 20 points for your level of education and training. So if you didn't finish high school, probably 5 points, right? If you have a PhD or you're a master craftsman, then 20 points. You got 15 points for your personal qualities. Are you adaptable? Are you motivated to settle in Canada, etc.? 15 points if there's a lot of demand for workers with your skills, occupational demand. 10 points for your occupational skill. So if you're an unskilled worker, 0 points. Again, if you're a master electrician, 10 points. 10 points for your age. So what age they're looking for here, that hasn't changed much. It's around the 18 to 35 area because they figure those are the most productive years of your life and that's when they want you. If you had a job arranged, you could get up to 10 points. No job, 0 points. If you're proficient in English or French, 10 points. If you have no relatives in Canada, 0 points. Distant relatives in Canada, 3 points. Close relatives in Canada, 5 points. So this merit point system was an attempt to get rid of the racist assessments. It was an attempt to emphasize employment as the main reason for immigration. And it also added an appeals procedure for the first time. So one of the best ways to assess the effectiveness of a policy is to wait 10 years and see what happens. So if you look at the two columns here, you'll see one is the immigration to Canada in 1968 and one is immigration to Canada in 1978. It sets the Caribbean number. I'll talk about that in a sec. So the biggest group in both categories is still British and American folks. So, but in 1978, it's not as high as it is in 1968. We'll come back to talking about Italians in a minute. If you look at the Asian numbers, so in 1968, about 20,000, and then in 1978, 32,000. So this makes it clear that there were more Asians able to immigrate under the point system than before. But the Caribbean numbers are the ones where you can really see the racism of the system before 1968. So in 1968, there were less than 9,000 Caribbean immigrants who came into Canada. In 1976, not even 78, so not even 10 years later, there is twice as many, right? So it is really obvious that anti-Black racism was totally a factor in admission to Canada before the merit point system. So what has happened with the introduction of the merit point system is a reversal of the traditional proportion of white to non-white immigrants to Canada. So whereas before the merit point system, most immigrants to Canada had been white people, after the merit point system, most immigrants to Canada are not white people. We're going to talk about refugees for a whole week later on, so I'm just going to sort of quickly touch on a few points here. In 1969, as Mr. Isajiw tells you, Canada joined the UN Convention on Refugees. Between 1968 and 76, we accepted more than 35,000 refugees, which seems like a small number these days because there are so many more refugees because of the problems that climate change is causing. So since 1968, Canada admitted almost 13,000 Czechoslovakians when there was uprisings in Czechoslovakia. In 1970, when China annexed more of Tibet, Canada accepted numerous Tibetan refugees. I know that 228 seems like a really small number compared to the other numbers there, but Tibetans seldom leave Tibet, well, permanently at any rate, so that's actually a very high number. In 1972, the ruler of Uganda, Idi Amin at the time, threw out the South Asians who had accompanied the British when the British colonized, and many of those South Asians came to Canada, 7,000. In 1973, General Augusto Pinochet, with support from the American military, overthrew the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile, and brutally, it was brutal period. Yeah, people's hands cut off, people being herded into stadiums, people being tortured, etc. And many left-wing, lefty socialist, social democratic Chileans left. So Canada accepted 5,000 of them. Here we have a picture of a happy Chilean family in Canada in 1975. Canada also accepted a large number of refugees after the Vietnam War. So in 1975 and 1976, Canada accepted almost 7,000 Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees. Many of these had escaped their countries after the Americans fled on boats. They took the boats to places like Malaysia and the refugee camps, and this earned them the title of boat people. And here you have a picture of one of those boats. In 1972, the government launched a program to try and deal with the number of non-status or undocumented, sometimes called illegal, immigrants in Canada. They were given 60 days, 2 months of amnesty in which they could come forward and apply for permanent residency. This program worked incredibly well. Almost 32,000 people came forward, and the vast majority of them were granted residency. Those who weren't granted residency often weren't because they had committed a crime or something similar. Activists and immigration advocates are pushing for there to be similar programs again today. This is called a regularization program, and numbers of non-status immigrants in Canada are again high, and these people pay taxes, they work, they are parts of our communities, but they often live in fear. They can't take advantage of things like healthcare, education, etc. And yeah, they are an easily exploited workforce also. So groups like No One is Illegal are trying to get the Canadian government to institute another regularization program like the one in 1972. In 1974, the government released another one of those papers. This one was called a Green Paper, and it had recommendations for future immigration policy. Those recommendations were turned into the Immigration Act of 1976, and that law linked the economy even more tightly to immigration. So if you had a job, you were likely to be able to immigrate. If you didn't have a job waiting for you, it was much less likely. This law also added a location factor. So if you were willing to move to remote parts of Canada that needed workers, you could earn extra merit points. And the regulations around family reunification were tightened, right? So you stopped being able to bring your cousins, etc. This law set yearly immigration levels based on the economy, and the levels of before 2001 were often around 250,000 and often didn't quite get met. This law removed the ad hoc nature of refugee acceptance and for the first time rolled refugees into the Immigration Act. This is one of my favorite pictures in the presentation. These are Communist Party members protesting the Green Paper in 1975, and I particularly like it because it's just so 70s, right? So there's two main things I want you to know about the 1980s, and one is about the Employment Authorization Program. Isajiw talks about it briefly. It was changed to the Live-In Caregiver Program, and the Live-In Caregiver Program has been scrapped and replaced by two new programs because the Live-In Caregiver Program, like the Employment Authorization Program, was found to be rife with abuse. So both of these programs left domestic workers who were coming to Canada to work for 2 years in order to get the right to apply for permanent residency. It started out in the 80s with Caribbean women. The Caribbean women sort of realized what a bad deal this was after a while and organized themselves into advocacy groups. And then the focus of employers shifted to women from the Philippines who have also now organized themselves into advocacy groups to challenge the really bad conditions that these programs allow. So these programs both left domestics trapped in private homes. There was no sort of inspection to make sure that these bosses were decent bosses or treating their workers okay. These women were often underpaid. They were often overworked. They're expected to work 24/7 because they live with their employer. They were often isolated from their communities. Some employers would confiscate their passports and not let them out of the house. They were often abused, sometimes sexually. I've heard stories of employers going on vacation and locking the domestic in the house. They had few rights and very little recourse if anything went wrong because their visa was tied to their boss, and so they couldn't really complain. So as I said, both these programs have been scrapped now. There was also a business immigration program that allowed rich people, it was $1 million the last I looked, but when it began it was $500,000, to invest in Canada and to skip the point system. This program was audited in 1999, and the auditor found that the system had been totally taken advantage. Many of these investors never actually invested any money in Canada, but they happily kept their Canadian passports. The other thing that Isajiw mentions that's of note is that since 1992, more women than men have been immigrants, and it's the same globally. More women than men have been moving around the globe since 1992. This is a really big change. Historians and others who study migration will tell you that for the vast majority of history, it has been men who are the migrants and the immigrants, and women tend to follow. The first wave is often men, and then women will follow. Women are more likely to stay home and tend the hearth. And so migration theorists have two ideas about why this has changed. There's one more optimistic and one more pessimistic. The optimistic one is that there are more jobs for women, and so women who are heads of their household will move to make more money and be able to take better care of their families. The other theory is that things have gotten so bad in some parts of the world that women do not stay to take care of the home, that they want to get out because they want to get everybody out. So take your pick, or maybe it's a blend of the two. Now, since 1993, there have been a couple of things that have happened in Canada. So first, part of the context for the 1993 law is the formation of the Reform Party in the western part of Canada in 1987. If you look into the early documents and speeches and so on out of the Reform Party, you can see that they're incredibly anti-immigrant and I would say often racist. So they were against immigration. And since the formation of the Reform Party, which then turned into the Conservative Party, there has been a shift in public discussions in Canada about immigration. I've watched this shift. So when I was a young woman, immigration was often talked about as good for Canada, as something we did because we're an awesome country and we have lots of compassion. And nowadays, it's not talked about that way. It's often talked about as immigrants are security threats, they're dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there's been a real change that's partly because of the change in Canadian politics. So Bill C-86 was passed in 1993. It's the Immigration Act. It set annual limits on the number of immigrants accepted in each category. It also included a kind of law and order agenda. So up until 2004, Canada did not have immigration police. In fact, when I was younger, Canadian comedians used to mock the United States for thinking that immigration was something you needed police for. The law and order agenda didn't start after 9/11. It actually started in 93. The Bill C-86 gave immigration officials at the senior level the ability to refuse refugee claims at points of entry, which was completely against the Canadian tradition of letting refugees into the country to tell their story and then deciding whether or not they could stay. It also set up special rights for those officers to stop so-called illegal immigrants. In 1995, largely due to the Conservative Party's pressure to try and download the cost of the immigration system onto immigrants, a head tax or a right of landing fee was initiated. So it started out at nearly $1,000. I think it's down to about $500 now. But what it means is that many immigrants start out their life in debt to the Canadian government. So some of the trends before 2000. So about 50% of the immigrants coming to Canada before 2001 were family related, were sponsored immigrants. Before 1961, 90% of the immigration to Canada was from Europe. At the turn of the millennia, 2000, Europeans only made up a fifth of immigration to Canada. About 60% of immigration was from Asia, and about a fifth was from South America, the Caribbean, and the United States. And of course, since 2001, there have been a bunch of security-related quote-unquote changes. Since the attacks on the World Trade Towers, there's been this kind of right-wing push to enhance security in the overdeveloped world, in the rich countries of the world. And this enhanced security is often xenophobic and racist, as if immigrants were a threat. And this security push has also cost us both civil and human rights. So some stuff that's not in the reading, but that I want to flag, we're going to talk about this later on, is one of the biggest trends since 2000, it's not in the reading because the reading was published in 99, has been the steady increase in temporary foreign workers instead of immigrants. So temporary foreign workers are not immigrants. They are migrant workers. Most of them have no path to immigrate to Canada. They are only allowed to stay here as long as their jobs, and their staying here depends on their bosses. So their bosses usually control their visas, and if they are injured, if they try to organize a union, or if they complain too loudly, they are often sent home. They have very few rights. They are often exploited and abused and endangered by their employers, and this has become more evident lately. So programs like the Live-In Caregiver Program and the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program have been widely criticized by human rights groups. And recently, farm workers in the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program have been decimated by COVID. Both their bosses and the governments have refused to put safety measures in place to protect them. They continue to be made to work and live in very close quarters despite the danger.